It is difficult to imagine the Philippine educational landscape without the private schools. The private schools help the state fulfill its mandate of making quality education accessible to all Filipinos. It is in recognition of this role that the Fund for Assistance to Private Education, a permanent trust fund for private education, was established through Executive Order 156 on November 5, 1968. The Private Education Assistance Committee, or the PEAC, was created as the trustee of the fund. The PEAC is composed of the Secretary of Education as the ex officio chair and a representative each from the National Economic Development Authority, Catholic Educational Association of the Philippines, Philippine Association of Colleges and Universities, and Association of Christian Schools, Colleges, and Universities. For the development of private education, the PEAC takes on the role of funder, advocate, partner, and enabler. A national secretariat headed by an executive director executes the policies, programs, and initiatives of the PEAC for private education. In 1989, a landmark piece of legislation, RA 6728, or the Government Assistance to Students and Teachers in Private Education, or GASPE, was passed. The GASPE Act, which was amended by RA 8545 in 1998, institutionalized government assistance to private education in the country. The Educational Service Contracting, or ESC, Teacher Salary Subsidy, or TSS, Senior High School Voucher Program, the In-Service Training, or INSET, and research are part of the Department of Education's GASPE program. The PEAC implements the GASPE program given the track record of the PEAC in program management. The PEAC has been involved in the development of the ESC, from piloting a scheme, which was a precursor to the ESC in 1982 to 1986, to implementing the ESC in 1986 to 1991, and from 1996 up to the present. The ESC today has close to 1 million beneficiaries. Part of the PEAC infrastructure for the GASPE program is the Regional Secretariat. The PEAC-RS is headed by the Regional Program Director, who designates a Regional Program Coordinator for the day-to-day program implementation in the region. The PEAC has the following responsibilities in the GASPE program: orientation, ESC certification, SHS voucher applications, processing, monitoring, resolving cases of schools with adverse findings, regular meetings and consultations with stakeholders, research and data gathering, in-service training. The PEAC is also accredited as a local continuing professional development, or CPD, provider by the Professional Regulation Commission, or PRC. Participants of the INSET programs offered by the PEAC have the opportunity to earn the required CPD units for the renewal of their professional licenses. From 2012 to 2017, the PEAC trained a total of more than 70,000 junior high school teachers, and since 2016, an estimated 17,000 SHS teachers. The PEAC also implements its own programs of assistance. The Assistance to Programs and Initiatives to Reform Education, or ASPIRE, gave funding support in the amount of 33.7 million to 99 projects of private educational associations since 2015 to 2016. The Research for School Improvement Towards Excellence has assisted 79 private school administrators and teachers writing their theses and dissertation since 2015 to 2016. The Dissemination Assistance to Research and Education, or DARE, has supported 16 faculty members who presented their papers in international conferences abroad since it was launched in 2016 to 2017. The Philippine Education Research Journal is an online resource for decision makers, policymakers, and practitioners in education. Its editorial board consists of highly respected educators and researchers. The Philippine Education Conference is an opportunity for school administrators and teachers to learn from educational leaders and experts here and abroad as they discuss educational issues, concerns, trends, and innovations. Recognizing the inherent strengths of the private schools in achieving excellence in Philippine education, the PEAC is committed to promoting private education as an integral part of our educational system.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Presi Labao. I'm the Training and Development Officer of the PEAC National Secretariat. Today is our second day of the webinar series for grades 4 to 10 in 10 subject areas. As today, PEAC hosted a webinar on streamlining the K-12 curriculum, an approach to determining which standards and competencies to teach in Araling Panlipunan, English, and Filipino. Our speakers this week are PEAC trainers in the junior high school inset. This morning, we shall continue this webinar series in the area of mathematics. Allow me to introduce to you now our speaker in math. Our speaker is Mr. Raul Fernando L. Ballesteros. He's the principal at St. Benedict Childhood Education Center in Cebu City. Mr. Ballesteros completed his master's in education, major in math from the University of St. LaSalle last 2019. For 13 years, he was a faculty member of the University of St. LaSalle Integrated School in Bacolod City, where he served as a math and economics teacher and as the Student Affairs Council moderator during his last 3 years. Sir Rafi, as he's fondly called, is a PEAC trainer and module writer in mathematics since 2012. Good morning, Sir Rafi.
Good morning, Ms. Presi. Thank you for the very kind introduction. So let me now share my screen.
Sir Rafi is live today from Bacolod City.
Okay, I shall start. To all our passionate and committed teachers who are tuning in to this morning's webinar, hello and welcome. Despite the disruptions brought about by the current health crisis, education must continue and learning must never stop. Welcome to this PEAC-sponsored webinar on streamlining the K-12 curriculum, an approach to determining which K-12 standards and competencies to teach. My name is Rafi, and it is my honor and privilege to be of service to all of you this morning. Just a few reminders as we begin our webinar. Please take note that you are highly encouraged to jot down important facts that you can get from this session. You will be given the time to ask questions after my talk, and handouts will be available for downloads after the end of the webinar on Thursday. Aside from that, please take time to view the presentation in full screen on your device so you can better appreciate the content. The first question that must be in your mind this morning is, what will be my takeaways for this webinar? What are we trying to answer in this webinar this morning? Our focus question would be, how will schools now in the new normal be able to cover the contents of the K-12 curriculum, specifically in the area of mathematics? In order to achieve this end, we have the following objectives in mind. First, we will discuss the rationale and parts of the DepEd MELCs curriculum guide for school year 2020-2021. Second, we will explain the process of streamlining K-12 standards and competencies. Third, we will relate the importance of alignment in streamlining with PEAC recertification. And lastly, we will apply the process to selected units of study in a subject area for curriculum mapping, identification of instructional materials, and preparation of the unit calendar. Please take note that everything that we will talk about in this webinar are all connected to the discussion with regards to the PEAC e-certification, which this year will be called an e-recertification. So the question is, are you ready? I'm sure you are. So let's proceed. We know very well that GAITF has made an announcement that private schools that are opening classes in June must be able to get GAITF okay, which means that they comply with the minimum health standards, and that as of now, no face-to-face classes can be held on campus. So in light with the directives from GAITF and that of DepEds, what should private schools need to do in order to be ready for school year 2020-2021? According to DepEd Order number 007 series of 2020, private schools must submit 3 very important documents. First, compliance with. Second, the learning continuity plan, which includes the curriculum of the school. And third would be the school calendar, which will indicate the various instructional modalities that your schools will be adapting. PEAC has also announced some requirements for certification. ESE schools that are due for recertification have to submit the requirements from September 31 to 30, 2020. And part of the requirements will be the curriculum map of the school. Schools need to be ready for remote certification starting November 2020 until March 2021. Thus, we can say that the topic in this morning's webinar will indeed assist the schools as they prepare their schools. So what do ESC participating schools need to do in order to be ready for this so-called e-recertification? On screen, you see 3 very important materials. First would be the PEAC certification assessment instrument, or what we call as the CAI, self-ratings and evidences of compliance. Second, the PEAC school recovery and readiness assessment tool results. And third would be the PEAC school recovery and readiness plan in line with DepEd learning continuity plan. As announced in a PEAC-sponsored webinar 2 weeks ago, schools need to complete the assessment instrument regarding school readiness and recovery. Aside from that, to come up with a plan in line with DepEd's learning continuity plan, the results of the assessment tool and the readiness plan will be attached to the self-ratings of the school using the PEAC certification assessment instrument. And of course, the preparation of evidences of compliance. What will be submitted online is the PEAC certification assessment instrument self-ratings and all the other document viewing online by the certifiers. In other words, that very important school curriculum document is part of DepEd's Learning Continuity Plan and the PEAC e-recertification. So the question now is, how will the ESC schools in school year 2020-2021 prepare the school curriculum if it needs to be submitted both to DepEd and to PEAC? So in order to prepare the school's curriculum, we look at a very important document which we call as a curriculum map. What you see on screen is a sample diary curriculum map. Let's try to see the parts that make up the map. We have actually 9 columns with 9 different headings. So the first column contains the term number or the month. It may contain the quarter. The second column will indicate the unit topic or the content. The third and fourth columns will contain the standards, both content and performance standards. The fifth column will contain competencies or skills. Then the sixth column will contain the assessments, followed by the activities, then the resources, and finally, the institutional core values. Given the number of columns that you have to complete, how can ESC schools prepare this curriculum map that covers the K-12 standards and competencies in the new normal and meets recertification requirements? Before we dwell into the completion of these different parts, let us first ask ourselves, what will the new normal look like as far as our educational system is concerned? Here are the facts. Aside from social distancing, we have to accept the fact that the school calendar will be shortened from 40 weeks down to 33 weeks. Is that a concern? Of course, that's a concern. Then we look into varied instructional modalities, which means to say we no longer see our students every day. It means to say that we do synchronous or asynchronous learning, or probably offline learning through modules, because our contact with them face-to-face will be very limited. It will also signal reduced class time, and we also expect frequent disruptions due to outbreaks. In other words, the new normal is telling us teaching time will be affected. And therefore, what are the adjustments that we need to make? So how then do we create that curriculum if we do not have anymore the luxury or the regular number of days that we used to have before this public health crisis? There are 3 things that we need to consider. First, we look at the DepEd Subject Curriculum Guide. Then we also consider the contents of the newly released MELCs matrix. And lastly, we look at the standards of compliance in the PEAC certification assessment instrument. All documents are utilized or will be utilized, referred to, and incorporated in preparing the school's curriculum map for the incoming school year. So let's take a look at each of these sources. First question, is the 2016 curriculum guide replaced by the MELCs? And what does the MELCs itself tell us? According to the guidelines on the use of MELCs found on page 2, and I quote, releasing the MELCs does not downplay the standards set by the K-12 curriculum guides. Rather, these serve as guides to teachers as they address the instructional needs of the learners. Take note, while ensuring that curriculum standards are maintained and achieved. From this quotation, we can truly say that the MELCs matrix does not replace the 2016 curriculum guide. If you read further through the Filipino Briefer on page 33, it explains, and I quote, tandaan na ang layunin sa pagbuo ng MELCs ay hindi upang palitan ang kasalukuyang curriculum guide, kundi upang magabayan ang mga guro sa pagtukoy ng mga competency mas kinakailangan ng mga mag-aaral sa taong panuruang 2020-2021. Sa huli, hinihikayat pa rin ang mga guro na sumangguni sa curriculum guide, referring to the 2016 curriculum guide, kung sa tingin nilang hindi sapat ang mga competency tinukoy sa MELCs. Here we see that the use of MELCs is not prescriptive. It is, as what one briefer says, suggestive. That's why it's best to look at the two documents and try to see what are common and what are different. Remember, we are highlighting here our role as designers. There is a certain way of looking at the MELCs that we need to be aware of. The MELCs, my dear teachers, is only a temporary arrangement, which means that any decisions that you make on the use of the MELCs, we must always have in mind the return of the full use of the 2016 curriculum guide. In other words, we need to strike a balance between what we have in the existing 2016 curriculum guide and the suggestions that are given in the MELCs. So my dear teachers, that's very clear. The MELCs matrix does not replace the existing 2016 curriculum guide. And the third source that we have to consider would be the standards of compliance set by PEAC, most especially in the area of curriculum assessment and instruction. What you see on screen is the tool that PEAC certifiers will be using. And we have here the expectations regarding what a school curriculum map should contain. These are the requirements. And if you try to look at the requirements, these are just reiterations of what DepEd is saying regarding the way we prepare the curriculum. A lot that is being mentioned in the standards of compliance are also being mentioned in the briefers of the MELCs matrix. So later on, we will revisit the tool and we will try to see what are the recurring words that you see in the tool that also point out to what the curriculum guide and the MELCs matrix are saying. So given the challenge of coming up with a curriculum guide, how do we answer the question that I asked a while ago? The answer is simple. We prepare our curriculum map by using the DepEd curriculum guide and or DepEd MELCs and the PEAC certification assessment instrument. These are the three sources that are very important in the preparation of the curriculum map. So now, let's try to look at closely the contents of this map. And your question is, where do we get all these? Let's begin with the unit topic and the standards. All these can be found in the 2016 curriculum guide as well as in the MELCs. So it's best that you put the two documents side by side so you will see for yourself. Where do the competencies come from? Again, from the DepEd Curriculum Guide of 2016 and the MELCs matrix. Now, if you look at the documents on the curriculum guide and the MELCs matrix, you won't be able to see any suggestions on assessments and activities because all these are provided or will be provided by you, the subject teachers, by us, because we are the designers. We too are assessors, and in the end, we're also facilitators. And the last column on institutional core values, we take that out from the school's vision, mission, and objectives, and we make sure that they're aligned with the rest of the components. In today's webinar, we will be going to have a walkthrough of these different parts. So, in other words, if you look at the slide, you see arrows, right? What are the arrows for? What do you think do the arrows indicate? What do they remind us of? Many of you will say, arrows establish connections. You're right, because as we complete the different parts of our curriculum map, the CAI is always looking at the alignment among the parts. So it is not just a matter of making sure that the columns are filled up. We need to make sure that whatever is required by the standards and the competencies, we have corresponding assessments, activities, and resources, and the appropriate institutional core values that we are going to be integrating. Alignment, integration. These are very important keywords as you complete the curriculum map. And so as you go back to that document of PEAC that will be used to assess your curriculum, assessment and instruction, you see the word alignment recurring. And it highlights two very important kinds of alignments: horizontal and vertical. When you say horizontal, it means that the entries from the left column to the right have connections. And when you say vertical alignment, pointing out to the progression of skills, thus the term vertical learning progressions, it means that the skills or the entries contained in each column from top to bottom progress. They are aligned, ladderized, and in the case of math, you see the beauty of spiraling. So going back to the different parts, let's take a short review of what you mean when you say content and performance standards. So in the previous inset that we had been conducting every summer, there are two basic questions that we ask when we look at content and performance standards. When you say content standard, you are merely asking the question, what content or skills will I teach? And what am I expecting students to know and be able to do? Content standards cover a specified scope of sequential topics, identify the set of essential knowledge and understanding that must be learned. But if we were to be true to our promise of preparing our students after grade 12 for work, and for college, and for life, the performance standard will give essence and meaning to the concepts that we are teaching, as it seeks to answer the question, how will students be able to use what they have learned? The performance standards describe the abilities and skills that the learners are expected to demonstrate in relation to the content standards. And as they apply their skills to concrete real-world experiences that will make learning more worthwhile and meaningful. As mentioned in the MELCs document Science Briefer, page 42, the K-12 basic education curriculum is standards-based. Even though the title of the document is Most Essential Learning Competencies, we need to remember that these MELCs are still based on standards. They are anchored on standards. If you look at your copy of when the MELCs matrix, you will notice that the standards are very alive and will be used. So what is important to remember then, as contained in the guidelines of the use of MELCs, page 3, and I read, the content and performance standards are directly lifted from the curriculum guides. Its inclusion is to emphasize that the identification of the MELCs is anchored on the prescribed standards and not a departure from the standards-based basic education curriculum. Thus, teachers are encouraged to refer to the 2016 curriculum guides in unpacking the MELCs. What is interesting, my dear teachers, in this quotation from this briefer? It tells us that the guide in the use of MELCs is that we always need to look at the competencies in relation to the standards. We cannot be teaching the competencies separately from the standards. So we always have to ask ourselves, what is the connection between the competencies and the standards? Or are they connected? And the second thing that we need to consider is that teachers still need to do the process of unpacking. The MELCs may not be sufficient. We may need to break down into sub-competencies and even add more competencies in order to achieve the standards. Our decision in the choice of the competencies will always be guided by the content and performance standards. And as you will see later on, between the content standard and the performance standard, there will be now more emphasis on the performance standard. Thus, we can say that the content standard is going to be at the service of the performance standard. Going back to the two questions on standards a while ago, if the content standards will be asking the question, will answer the question, what will students know and be able to do? While the performance standards will answer the question, where will students use that, or how will they apply that in their daily lives? Without content, performance can never be achieved in its true and authentic sense. So the next component that we have to accomplish will be the competencies or the skills. Now, this is the part that will take some time for us to really think about. Where are we going to get the list of the competencies and skills? We are going to get that from the 2016 curriculum guide together with the DepEd matrix. It's either we use both, or if we find in one quarter that it's easier to use the existing guide, then we use the 2016 guide. Or probably in another quarter, maybe we can use the contents of the MELCs matrix. Just remember one very important thing. Regardless of the document that you will use and the competencies that you will write under this column, always ask yourselves, do this lead the students to the attainment of the standards? The entries under this column are determined by both the content and the performance standards. So let's take a closer look at the competencies. What are competencies? Competencies refer to the knowledge, skills, and attitudes that students need in order to demonstrate a particular learning activity or the tasks needed in every lesson, as explained in a science briefer, page 42. These standards are further represented as learning competencies. This quotation tells us that there is an alignment, there should be an alignment among the standards, competencies, and activities, thus the arrows pointing from left to right. The standards determine the competencies, and the competencies in turn determine the activities. The activities should be chosen in such a way that they help develop the competencies, and the competencies in turn are necessary in order to achieve the standards. So what does it mean when you say essential learning competencies? The guidelines on the use of MELCs, page 2, lays down the characteristics that make a learning competency essential. First, it should be aligned with national, state, and/or local standards or framework. In our case, what do we hope students to become? Our students to become problem solvers. Will the learning competencies promote that skill of problem solving? Will it allow the students to exhibit the 7 C's? Number 2, it connects the content to higher concepts across content areas. Will it prepare the students for the next grade level or for succeeding grade levels? It is applicable to real-life situations, meaning to say, we move beyond the procedural teaching of math to real-life applications that will have more meaning. If students left school after this grade, it would be important for them to have this competence above many others. And it wouldn't be expected that most students would learn this through their parents and communities, if not taught in school. So the document in MELCs tells us why is there a need to have what you call the most essential learning competencies. As the Department of Education anticipates the challenges employing various schemes in the delivery of the learning standards due to the pandemic, the number of identified essential learning competencies per quarter were further reduced. Thus, the term most essential learning competencies. How much was reduced? Let's try to see. From 14,171 learning competencies, it's reduced by 60%. And now we're only talking about 5,689 learning competencies, 40%. Because there is not enough time to cover the 14,171 competencies. So, how were these MELCs identified? Paano nga ba? What criterion was used to identify the most important learning competencies? According to the guidelines on the use of MELCs, in determining the most essential learning competencies, the department collaborated with stakeholders from the Assessment, Curriculum, and Technology Research Center, or the ACTRC, during which the descriptor endurance was considered as the primary determining factor. A learning competency is considered enduring if it remains with learners long after a test or unit of study is completed, or if it is useful beyond a single test or unit of study. Examples of such learning competencies include research skills, reading comprehension, writing, map reading, and hypothesis testing, which are essential in many professions and in everyday life. One of the many things that we have to remember, my dear teachers, the MELCs for transfer of learning. When you say endurance, if it's meant for lifelong learning, meaning it will go beyond even after instruction has ended, it means that it is and it should be looked for in the real world, in the workplace, or in the practice of one's profession. We are always bent on asking, every time we teach a particular lesson to the students, we always ask ourselves the question, in which area of life will this particular concept be used after the students get out of school? One of the many things that we have to remember is that if we look at competencies, we only don't consider competencies that are retained in memory, because that is not the meaning of endurance in this case. But these are the competencies that are being used in the profession. Endurance means lifelong learning value. At the end of the quotation, you will see the sources that DepEd used. It's a document of Reeves, Manny, and Horrell. So in the area of math, what does it say about MELCs? According to the math briefer, the identified most essential learning competencies in math puts premium on the development of numeracy skills, which are fundamental to practical real-life situations, rather than on math content knowledge and on the development of higher order thinking skills, which goes beyond simply following the procedures in solving a particular concept. They are actually looking at 4 important characteristics that will make a particular competency of lifelong learning value. And this is represented by the acronym REAL. REAL refers to 4 criteria that are being used to assess whether a competency is considered power or simply supporting, which we will talk about later. This document can be downloaded from the internet, and the source is highlighted at the bottom of the screen. So R stands for readiness, E for endurance, A for assessment, and L for leverage. We're done with the second part on competencies. Now let's go to the other parts. If endurance points out to transfer of learning to real life, how will that be facilitated in the classroom? My dear teachers, when you say endure, it does not mean you give students a lot of work. Again, endurance does not mean that students need to work on the task for long hours of time. Endurance means transfer of learning to real life. So looking at the certification assessment instrument in the area of lesson planning, what does it tell us about lifelong learning? The second bullet is telling us learning plans should be systematic and should contain progressive development of student skills, resulting in the understanding and culminating in transfer of learning. 3 things are pointed out: acquisition, meaning making, and transfer as the core learning goals to promote lifelong learning. What we are deciding on which competencies to tackle in the curriculum map as per guidelines of MELCs, we should be thinking about endurance or transfer of learning. This is also the same thing that we're asked to think about as we look at the certification assessment instrument. In other words, since transfer of learning to real life is emphasized in the most essential learning competencies matrix, how do we ensure its achievement in the curriculum design? Whether we are looking at the 2016 MELCs or the 2020 MELCs, the 2016 curriculum guide, or the PEAC certification assessment instrument, they are pointing to one and the same direction: the transfer of learning to real life. Since this is the common destination, how then do we ensure that in our curriculum maps, the development of the lesson is leading towards transfer of learning? What are some of the specific techniques that we can do to reach this common destination? These techniques are taken from the briefers of the MELCs matrix, and they can be summarized into 7. So MELCs is telling us, in order to ensure endurance or transfer of learning, we can do any of the following. Again, any of the following. It does not mean all. Number 1, we unpack into sub-competencies or tasks. 2, we repeat in another unit or grade level. 3, we follow up in higher grade levels. 4, we cluster with other competencies. 5, we merge with other competencies and rephrase. 6, we focus on the skill rather than on content. And 7, we align with unit performance standard. 4 and 5 may sound alike, but there's a difference because in number 4, there is no rephrasing. Again, I would like to reiterate, these techniques are related to MELCs. Again, don't be stressed. You're not doing everything. It depends on what's applicable and what is appropriate to your subject area. So let's try to look at these techniques one by one. Unpack MELC. In particular technique, I will be presenting English as an example. So in English grade 7, quarter 4, the competency is employ a variety of strategies for effective interpersonal communication, interview, dialogue, and conversation. Now, if you will look at that competency as it is, you may find it hard to actually answer the question, how will I teach this? So the best technique that you can use is to break down this competency, which is very broad, into sub-competencies so that you can deliver your lesson systematically and the students can see better connections. Thus, this particular competency can be broken down into 5 sub-competencies. And this 5 will help attain that mother competency. Second, repeat MELCs in another grade level for reinforcement. If you look at our curriculum in math, the skills are recurring. In every grade level, they progress. And that is why it's important to be aware of these progressions. Patterns and algebra. There is a connection among the competencies contained in grades 1, 2, and 3 of quarter 3. You're using the word determine, but the context varies. In other words, we have to be aware that these competencies will still be reinforced in the next grade level. There is no need to dwell too long on the competencies because if you will remember, they will still be revisited. Now, this is what I always give as an advice to the teachers. Before you make your curriculum map, try to understand the entire curriculum guide for math. So the progression will be clear to you. Many teachers are always stuck in a particular lesson, leaving behind the rest and making students move up to the next level very deficient in terms of skills. By understanding that some most essential learning competencies will be reinforced, you can give more focus on important lessons as well. The third is to be aware that the MELCs are being followed up in grade levels, in other grade levels. That is why some of the competencies had been deleted, some had been retained. Now, let's look at the first column under the headings, or the first row, I mean. The deleted competency states, it's stated in this way, identifies proper, improper fractions and mixed numbers. Now that was deleted, and what was retained? Changes improper fractions to mixed numbers and vice versa. Take note that if you're a grade 4 teacher, if you read the entire curriculum guide in math, you will know that the kinds of fractions had already been introduced in grades 2 and 3. Therefore, as we choose the most essential competencies, now that we are pressed for time, that competency was deleted because it was already covered in the previous grade level. And what you can do is simply to revisit that as you teach that retained competency. In other words, if the students have already been introduced and your task now is simply to reinforce or to provide mastery, then we have to be aware about what have been discussed already and what will be discussed in the succeeding grade levels. The fourth technique is to cluster with other competencies. Let's look at the last example or the last row. The learning competencies represents integers on the number line and compares and arranges integers. It has been clustered, and the new competency is simply stated as compares and arranges integers on the number line. The deleted LC is already subsumed in the next LC. Because for you to effectively teach students how to compare and arrange integers on the number line, they must first learn how to represent those integers. In other words, that's a prerequisite and that is already included or subsumed. The fifth technique is to merge and rephrase. Let's look at the grade 8 example, quarter 2 on linear equations in two variables. Before, you have two competencies, illustrates linear equations in two variables and graphs linear equations in two variables. That two were clustered into simply one and was rephrased. Illustrates and graphs linear equations in two variables. Illustration is a prerequisite to the lesson on graphing. Okay. The sixth technique is called focus on skill rather than content. Again, if we want to promote transfer of learning, we have to make sure that they can apply the skills more than just learn the content. In grade 5, quarter 1, the 2016 CG included this competency. States, explains, and interprets parentheses, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, PEMDAS, or grouping, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction rule, or GMDAS. It's now rephrased to performs a series of more than two operations on whole numbers using the two rules. States, explains, and interprets would point at content. So it's not just allowing what is important, it's for students not just to state, explain, and interpret. What is important is they know how to apply what they have stated, explained, and interpreted in solving real-life problems involving a series of operations. And lastly, we have our seventh technique, which is to allow that all competencies are anchored on the standards. There needs to be alignment between standards and competencies. Now look at the verbs. Look at the verbs in your competencies. What do you see? Describe, illustrate, solve, proves, applies. Look at the verb in your performance standard. What does it say? Communicate mathematical thinking. Formulate. Solve real-life problems. Is there alignment? Will you allow your students to be able to successfully communicate mathematical thinking if those verbs will be used? Always ask yourselves the question, after I teach the students how to solve, say for example, for the corresponding parts of congruent triangles, how will they be able to communicate mathematical thinking with coherence and clarity? Is it the same as letting them go to the front to explain their solution? I don't think so. Therefore, if alignment between the standards and competencies is not very clear, something about it. Always ask yourselves, will these competencies lead to transfer? Will this alignment promote endurance? So given these gaps, how do we align standards and competencies to ensure transfer to real life or endurance for lifelong learning? What process can be done? This brings us to a very important concept which might be new to most of you. Streamlining the teaching and learning of the K-12 curriculum. Focus on what you see on screen. What does the picture reveal to you? What is shown on screen? Probably many of you would see, I see water. I see flowing water. I see uniformity. I feel being calm. I see one direction only. Streamlining, my dear teachers, is a physical thing. When the water is very calm and it is flowing in one direction, especially when it is falling, you will not see overlaps. You will see streamlines. You see patterns. Actually, this is an engineering feat. Engineers are trained how to do this. In the natural world, this does not occur naturally, but engineers can produce this as a 24/7 occurrence. So when we say streamline, what do we mean? It's a path traced by a massless particle moving with the flow. The flow follows a particular direction. And speaking about the flow, we talk about two kinds. Laminar. Okay, what do you see there? It's moving in one direction again. There are no arrows pointing in the opposite direction, nor do we see waves. We only see lines. Because in laminar flow, the fluid particles follow a smooth path in layers, or what you call laminae, moving parallel to each other. It has visible streamlines. Now take a look at another flow. What do you notice? Do you still see lines? Are they moving towards the same direction? Do they overlap? You call this flow as turbulent flow. The fluid particles move in a rough path, and there are cross currents and mixing of layers. In other words, there are swirling zones because the layers overlap. instead of the water flowing in the same direction, in some parts, the water flow turns back, overlaps, and rides on another layer, creating a swirling zone. As you look at our curriculum map, and as you do curriculum mapping, you can produce either laminar or turbulent flow. Now, let's look at an example of turbulent flow. If as a teacher, you cannot establish a connection between the competencies and the standards, how will you ensure endurance or lifelong learning? This particular illustration is showing us that if we are not very careful, the flow will become turbulent. And as we face our students, we will have a difficult time letting them see connections. On the other hand, if you look at this illustration, what is desirable in the design of this curriculum is really to have the laminar flow. Look at the columns from left to right, the flow from unit content down to resources. The arrows indicate connections. You see alignments. So the question is, what is streamlining all about? Streamlining, my dear teachers, is not simply reducing competencies. It is a process that allows us to establish alignments between standards, competencies, assessments, activities, and resources, thus creating a laminar flow. We don't want the students' learning experience to be turbulent, especially our own experience. So, to avoid the turbulence, as early as the planning and designing stage, we need to start clarifying. So what are the benefits of streamlining? Some of you will say, this is another task that lies in front of us. The process may be difficult, but just have in mind, once it's over, everything will be done smoothly as you go to the classrooms or through your online teaching. Okay. With streamlining, there is clarity of process. Connections are established. As the designer, teachers establish the connection. Later on, the students. So it benefits both the teachers and the students. So if there is clarity of process, this brings us to the second effect. You become an efficient and effective teacher. As you start to begin with the end in mind, you know where to lead the students to. By looking at the verbs which will establish or help establish the connections, you are focusing on the skills leading to transfer, both horizontally and vertically. Take note, when we say vertical learning, develop and scaffold the skills towards the attainment of the performance standard in order to attain endurance or lifelong learning value. There is conscious scaffolding leading to an authentic evidence of learning. That is an evidence of achieving the performance standard. So going back to the PEAC certification assessment instrument, these are the ingredients that will be looked into by the certifier when they examine your curriculum map. What's the key word again? Alignment. So, my dear teachers, if connections are established, will the flow become laminar or turbulent? Definitely you will agree it will be laminar. So streamlining is done using two techniques. We do this to move from turbulence to laminar flow. Technique A is aligning the content standard and the competencies with the performance standard. And technique B, which is connected with technique A, is identifying power and supporting competencies and clustering these. So let's try to see how one is different from the other. Let's start with technique letter A. Again, remember, the goal is endurance, lifelong learning value. And in order to help us lead our students to transfer, we are guided, or we will be guided by this very important document. So let's start with the words inside the boxes colored yellow. What are these words? Acquisition, meaning making, and transfer. Transfer goal and performance task. You see content and performance standards. You see the unit topic. But the more important thing that I want you to look into are the arrows. Why are they arranged in that way? What do the arrows mean? Why is the content standard placed under the performance standard? Why is transfer at the top? We will learn to answer that later as we complete the different parts. So to do technique A, there are 7 important steps. And in our discussion today, we will try to journey or walk through the 7 steps. So let's begin with step 1. Copy the content and performance steps. Again, review, my dear teachers. Where do you see the content and performance standards? I'm sure you're giving me the right answer. You see the standards in the 2016 curriculum guide or in the MELCs matrix. Lift the standards and put them inside the boxes under performance standard and content standard, and indicate the unit topic. So for the purpose of discussion, our unit topic is on axiomatic structures of geometry and triangle congruence, grade 8, quarter 3. And our content standard demonstrates understanding of key concepts of axiomatic structure of geometry. And our performance standard is able to formulate an organized plan to handle a real-life situation, is able to communicate mathematical thinking with coherence and clarity in formulating, investigating, analyzing, and solving real-life problems involving congruent triangles using the appropriate and accurate representation. So what we will do is to simply copy. The question is, given that we are leading the students to the performance standard, how do we unpack the transfer goal and the performance task from the performance standard? So remember that the transfer goal and the performance task are anchored in the performance standard. So read the performance standards first and select the highest order verb And in this case, we're actually looking at formulate, communicate, and solve. Among the three, which can lead students to lifelong learning? Is it just the formulating of the plan? Is it the solving of the real life problem? Or is it the communicating of the mathematical thinking with coherence and clarity? If you're a teacher inside the classroom, what would you prefer students to do? To simply make a plan? To simply solve? Or to simply try to relate what they have solved in the context of the problem that you have presented? And I'm sure you will agree with me, it's communicate that will promote lifelong learning. So that verb will be used to form the transfer goal, which is composed of 4 important characteristics or parts. It should begin with the phrase, students on their own and in the long run will be able to, plus the higher order verb, plus the product, plus the real world purpose. And that will be used to make the performance task following GRA-SPS. Now, I want you to look at this slide. What word is underlined in the 3? So you see communicate. It only shows that your performance task is anchored on your transfer goal, which is also anchored on your performance standard. That's what we mean by connection. That's what we mean by alignment. We are not just giving them any other task. We're giving them a task that will lead them to the attainment of the performance standard, making their learning endure and giving lifelong value to whatever learning they will achieve. So after step 2, we now go back to the document and we will now write the transfer goal on top of the transfer goal box and the performance task, the narrative, or probably only the title of your performance task, investigative report. Now, after unpacking the performance standard, we now have to review the curriculum guide and the school curriculum map in terms of the competencies, even the MELCs, and unpack the competencies. There are 8 core competencies in grade 8, quarter 3. And if you have attended the previous summer in-service trainings by the PEAC, we have presented to you several ways of unpacking the standards and the competencies. Now, in our discussion a while ago, we said that if you look at the competencies, you can hardly see the connection between the competencies and the standards. Therefore, let's try to examine the competencies found in MELCs and in the curriculum guide. And let's do step 4. Classify the unit competencies in terms of A, M, T learning goals. A and M are matched with the content standard and T is matched with the performance standard. You unpack if needed. So you might ask me, what will guide us in categorizing A, M, and T, our competencies into A, M, and T? We have a list of verbs to guide us. But my dear teachers, always remember this very important thing. The verbs are simply your guide. What will be actually important in deciding whether it's A, M, or T is the intended purpose or outcome of your competency. If you look at our assessment, we have here the summary. There are only 6 acquisition competencies, 2 for meaning making, and none for transfer. So the question is, if we teach all of these only, will it lead them to transfer of learning? The question is, Definitely not. Will the attainment of these competencies eventually lead students to transfer of learning? If you only have A and M, will that satisfy? Will that be sufficient to promote transfer? The answer is no. And with this, we need to unpack. By unpacking, we can either do several techniques. And in this case, because we notice that there are no T competencies, then we might as well provide the competencies. If you do the method of unpacking and if you design your lesson carefully with the standards in mind, you notice that there are 3 additional competencies that would need to be included under A. And these are draws congruent figures, defines and gives examples of triangle congruence, identifies congruent corresponding parts of congruent triangles. Under M, because we want the students to transfer, before they can transfer, they have to make meaning of the facts. And by making meaning, we want them to generalize the importance of triangle congruence in real life structures, thus connecting the A and the T. And to let our students attain the performance standard, we add 4 transfer competencies: solves real-life problems involving triangle congruence, formulates questions to elicit mathematical thinking, investigates real-life structures using triangle congruence, and communicates mathematical thinking with coherence and clarity. After unpacking, we now have 9 acquisition competencies, 3 meaning-making, and 4 transfer, making the total number of competencies 16 from 8. So after classifying, we shall now place under content standard those competencies under A and M. The italicized competencies are the added competencies. And under performance standard, those competencies related to transfer still italicized because they are the added competencies before we place this diagram. So before that, step 5 involves unpacking the essential question and the enduring understanding with M cluster of competencies, establishing the link with content standards and performance tasks. Meaning making is the link between A and T. You cannot do transfer unless students are able to acquire and make meaning. And you cannot let them make meaning unless they have acquired. In this case, acquisition and meaning making are both at the service of transfer. So after unpacking the M, you now unpack the A and establish the link with the content standard and the performance task. Step 7 is to determine the assessments for acquisition and for meaning making. For acquisition, that could be included in the quarterly assessment, the skill of solving and many other skills included. And for meaning making, that can be included in written work through guided generalization as we develop student skills in proving and relating this exercise to real life situations. So, looking at the diagram, what can you say about the flow? Is it laminar or turbulent? Now that you'll be able to make the connections, can you say that it's laminar? Can you now go into the classroom and say, the connections are established, the activities are well connected, I can now make my students acquire, make meaning, and transfer. I'm sure we'll all agree that the flow is now laminar. Look at this now. Look at this illustration. We have now competencies that are added from 8, it's now 16. Are they all connected with the standards? The answer is yes. And because the connection is established, is the flow laminar or turbulent? Therefore, I'm sure you can say it is laminar. So let's now proceed. After clarifying or using technique A, which involves unpacking the competencies, we now go to technique B, which is identifying power and supporting competencies and clustering these competencies. Now, we are doing this. Some of you will say, there were 8 competencies. Now it's 16. What will happen to the budget of time? That's why technique B follows technique A. Your first question might be, what are power standards and competencies? Power standards are the most essential learning standards that students need to master because they provide a focus for teachers on what to teach. They are key learnings that promote higher order thinking skills. They present to us our priorities in terms of academic standards. They provide purpose or reason for learning a specific competency. Think of power competencies as the fence post holes. If you were to build a fence, you need to have sturdy post holes, which means to say you provide the curricular competencies that will lead them to the attainment of the performance standard. And these power competencies should pass all the criteria for real. But this fence post holes cannot stand long and cannot make the fence sturdy without the supporting competencies represented by the fence rails. The supporting competencies contribute to or serve as steps to the attainment of the power competency. If you think of a ladder, the steps on the ladder would be the support, and it will lead you to your main goal of the power competencies. So try to look at the table that you see on screen. Which competencies are power and which are support competencies? How do we know? We use 4 criteria: readiness, endurance, assessment, and leverage. And after doing that exercise, we can say that indeed, the second set of competencies are considered as power. So how do we do the steps of determining power competencies? So first, we identify the power and supporting competencies from real, then we cluster them, then we arrange them into sequence, and we set the budget of time. Again, you might ask me, why are we doing this? We want to prioritize the power competencies because we always recognize our limitation. We are pressed for time, most especially in this new normal. So in doing technique letter B, which components are critical for our students to know and understand? Which components, according to our state assessment data, do we especially need to emphasize? Which competencies represent concepts and skills that will endure? So we have our criteria, and let's try to understand each one. When the competency represents learning that is essential for success in a new unit, course of study, or succeeding grade level, it has readiness. The particular keyword is ready. Will my students be ready for the next lesson if I teach this competency? Therefore, we ask this guide question, does this standard contain prerequisite content and or skills necessary for the next unit or course of study or grade level? Look at this competency. Does it prepare the students for the next lesson? I'm sure your answer is yes, because you cannot prove triangle congruence without this very important lesson that will set the sturdy foundation. What do we mean by endurance? When the competency represents learning that goes beyond one course or grade level and is representative of a concept or skill that is important in life, it has endurance. Take note, my dear teachers, endurance equals lifelong value. Does this standard have value beyond a single test date? Will this standard endure beyond the test? Will the knowledge and skills be important beyond this unit of study? If you know all of these important terms in geometry, including the postulates and the theorems, and you learn to understand the ideas behind them, will that endure for life? I'm sure your answer is a big yes. Assessment. When the competency is often tested in achievement or admissions exam for a job, it has value for assessment. Will this particular competency be tested in national and international assessments? Look at the competency again. Lalabas ba yan? Will that be included? The answer again is yes. That is always asked in exams or even in qualifying exams. And lastly, we have leverage. When the competency represents learning that is applied both within the content area and in other content areas, it has leverage, meaning to say multidisciplinary. Does this standard have multidisciplinary connections? Is this standard relevant with other disciplines? Try to think now. Where can you use this standard aside from math? Can you use this in engineering? Can you use this in architecture? Can you use this in physics? I'm sure your answer is a big yes. So, in a table, you need to list down the competencies that you have, and you start determining whether each competency exhibits R, E, A, and L. So look at our assessments. Now you might ask me, after assessing, what will help us determine whether it is real or supporting? Take note, my dear teachers, that the main purpose of this exercise is to guide you that they should use real to identify the power standards. Regarding the deliberation of each criterion, I would like to make you remember that this is dependent on how your school's curriculum will prioritize or give emphasis. What do we hope to give emphasis on? Endurance and lifelong learning. So that is something that you have to consider. Functionality on the 21st century workplace. So, if your particular competency will all get check marks in the 4 criteria, then it is power. If there is one, just even one X mark, then automatically it becomes support. So I would suggest that when you do this in your workplace, collaborate with your teachers. with your co-teachers in the department because they might be able to give you inputs as well. So, if we summarize everything, we now have 4 power competencies and we have 12 supporting competencies. This brings us to step 2, which is to cluster the budget of time. So for every power competency, identify the supporting competencies so you can determine the budget of time. If we're given 8 weeks and you have 5 meetings every day for math, we target 40 days. And cluster 1, because the foundation needs to be very sturdy in order to make meaning and do transfer, we're spending 16 days. 8 days for cluster 2 and 8 days for transfer. Again, my dear teachers, you are the designer, you know best how to do the budget of time. And so we look at 3 clusters of 16 core competencies. After clustering, because they're now connected, do you see a smooth flow or a turbulent flow? I hope your answer is laminar. So we're done now looking at documents pertinent to the 2016 Curriculum Guide and to the MELCs matrix. We now proceed to a more challenging part, the planning of assessment activities resources and the alignment to the institutional core values. So for each of the power competencies and the supporting competencies, we need to assign an assessment. And remember, for many of you who are doing dual modes of instructional delivery, you have offline and online. So make sure that we plan out so that our students have the needed support and resources. The question is, what can we use as our source for the activities in the online and offline? This brings us to the PEAC modules that were now uploaded in the PEAC website through the PEAC Learning Module Repository, which is available for download. So, in that table that I will be presenting, let's try to sense. The power competency states solves real-life problems involving congruent triangles. And the supporting competency is solves corresponding parts of congruent triangles. Our assessment is problem solving. Does that match? The answer is yes. But what activities can we give? So it says here offline textbook activity or activity in the module. And the online activity says a worksheet that can be downloaded online. Now, if you look at the PEAC sample module on Math Quarter 3, Grade 8, on axiomatic structure of geometry and triangle congruence, we now see an example of an offline activity. The lesson is on reasoning. So you see there an activity that students can simply do at home because it's very detailed and the instructions are clear, and there is a skills practice leading to the coming up of a conjecture or a conclusion. That's found in the 2019 edition of Math Grade 8 LM, pages 34 to 37. So if you have a copy, you may start browsing. Now, what is good with the module is that aside from offline, it has very reliable online activities that will allow the students to attain the same learning competencies and at the same time answer very meaningful process questions and do interactive practice. So the PEAC learning module hits two birds at the same time, offline and online learning. And let's look at another activity on proving statements on triangle congruence. For offline, flow charts are provided. The presentation is very systematic in such a way that the students can actually practice on their own. Plus, the supplementary online activities, which allow them to listen to math pre-recorded lectures available on YouTube or websites and do the corresponding activities for submission online. So with the suggested activities, let's go back to the unit horizontal alignment and vertical progression. Do you see connections, my dear teachers? I'm sure you do. So looking at the sample diary curriculum map, the alignments can be made evident as we connect them with arrows. And that alignment will be very important in the process of certification. So this brings us to the next part. No? We have determined the budget of time. We have unpacked our competencies. It's now time to put everything in one unit learning calendar. Now, look at the calendar, my dear teachers. What is given more emphasis in terms of the learning goal? I'll give you 30 seconds to observe. Okay? Which is given more time? Acquisition, making meaning, or transfer? Right, it's meaning making and transfer because we want to promote lifelong learning. However, my dear teachers, this is just a suggestion because it will also depend on the kind of lessons that we have. But our advice is because in doing so, we still revisit acquisition through the learning competencies. Take note, this is the quarterly guide. Are you giving this to your students? And there are 9 learning areas. The answer is no. Students will only get the weekly activities and the related learning materials. We call it as the weekly learning guide. Students don't need to see a whole month of work. This document can be uploaded or distributed every Sunday or Monday morning. What's the reason? We want students to plan the week in terms of activities to do and secure the materials to use. Just a friendly reminder. For those doing online learning, we don't want the students to be going out and to be exposed to the outside environment. Think of materials that are available at home. And take note, these activities, my dear teachers, comes from the curriculum map. You are not making a new set of activities. Because if you do the laminar flow, if the laminar flow is established, learning will become very smooth for the students. I'm sure you will not find it hard to deliver your lesson because everything is systematic, clear, detailed, connected, and aligned. Now, another thing, when we talk about values, we focus on the institutional values, but we also choose values that are directly related to our own subject area. Valuing should be done smoothly in the program of the subject area. So, in summary, let me ask you, as you make your school's curriculum for e-recertification, what are your 3 sources again? Okay, number 1 is the 2016 curriculum guide. Number 2 is the MELCs matrix. And number 3 is the PEAC certification assessment instrument. These are 3 very important documents that we need to utilize and to incorporate as we plan the school's curriculum. My dear teachers, hindi sila hiwa-hiwalay. They have to be put together because these 3 documents are also connected and they point to one common destination: promote lifelong learning, ensure endurance. So if you look at the certification requirement in the curriculum map, where do you find the unit content and the standards? Again, from the 2016 CG or the MELCs together with the competencies. Who will make or plan out the assessments, activities, and the resources? No less than the teacher, who is the designer, the assessor, and the facilitator. And where will you get the institutional core values? From your mission, vision, and objectives. Why are we doing this? Very simple. The goal is to teach enduring skills for work and life in the 21st century. And how are we supposed to do this? We ensure endurance or transfer of learning by doing any of the following using the MELCs matrix. Unpack into sub-competencies, repeat in another unit or grade level for emphasis, follow up in higher grade level to promote higher thinking, cluster with other competencies, and eventually the need to rephrase, focus on skill rather than on content, and align with unit performance standards. To techniques, the technique of streamlining by aligning the content standard and the performance standard with the performance standard, and by identifying the power and supporting competencies and clustering these competencies. B is a continuation of A. If you remove or you add competencies, you're doing technique A, unpacking competencies. But if you want to focus on the budget of time, then you are now doing technique B, clustering, prioritizing, and dividing the budget of time. So I am very sure that there are a lot of things running in your head. What are the tasks that lie ahead? What will the new normal be all about? Now we have our own fears, our anxieties. Some of us are excited. Some of us are challenged. And I hope this exercise, this experience, will only bring out the best in all of us. So my dear teachers, while the task may be daunting, I'd like to leave you with this very important quote from Jack Ma. Never give up. Today is hard. Tomorrow will be worse. But the day after tomorrow, there will be sunshine. On behalf of PEAC, Thank you very much for taking part in this webinar. Good morning.
Thank you, Sir Rafi, for that clear discussion of streamlining in mathematics. I just have 3 questions here. Okay,
Yes,
the
Professor,
first
go ahead.
question, the first question is from St. Joseph College, Olongapo. If the MELCs was created because of the pandemic due to the reduction in the number of school days, will these impede the learning of the students, especially that we know there are learning gaps even without the pandemic?
Okay, that's why as designers of our own lessons, we are directed to 3 very important sources. We have to make good use of the 2016 curriculum guide and the contents of the MELC matrix. Examine carefully, and through the process of streamlining, make sure that we really prioritize the power competencies. Remember, this year may be challenging, but next year we can always address the gaps. No? By doing the process of streamlining, we give importance to the content that will promote endurance or lifelong learning. So refer to those 2 documents, and you know your students very well as the designers of your learning.
Thank you. The second question is the curriculum map format applicable to various learning delivery modes?
Yes, as suggested, no, although in the activities, we have 2 options. Now we split that into 2 columns because many schools right now are really having problems with connectivity issues as far as their clients are concerned. That is the reason why PEAC has generously shared the modules with you, because the curriculum map as our guide, no, will allow us to craft both online and offline activities that will facilitate the attainment of these competencies and standards. If you look at the module, each lesson has included both online and offline activities.
Okay, thank you. And the last question, what if may topic po na hindi naturo from the previous grade level and that topic was removed from the next grade level because it was assumed to have been taught? What must we do?
Okay, in math, if you look at the curriculum guide of math, the topics actually are all retained, only a few competencies. No? So I don't see gaps. Now, the only problem is, what if the previous teacher last year wasn't able to finish?
Yeah.
First and foremost, articulation within the department is very, very important. No?
Exactly.
That learning progression document will actually make you become aware of what was taught in the previous grade level and what is expected in the next grade level. So I would suggest that you revisit that document, talk it out with your co-teachers, because as the designers of your lesson, you can best plan how the sequence of lessons will look like for this school year.
Okay, and that is also speaking from a school leader's point of view. Thank you, Sir Rafi, for joining us this morning. Yes, sure. Go ahead, sir.
And my co-trainers, examples that I have presented were actually well written by the PEAC junior high school trainers who are also watching, and I would like to give credit to the work that they have done. No? And thank you, Dr. Mike Rapatan, thank you, Ms. Presi, thank you, Ms. Doris, and I'd like to say hello to all my teachers at St. Benedict Childhood Education Center. I hope they learned a lot.
Yeah, and I'm sure that will make them happy for the shout out. Thanks again, Sir Rafi. To our viewers, the video recording of this webinar in math will be available shortly in the PEAC Facebook page. I want to thank also everyone this morning, especially the math teachers Thank you also to our webinar team today, Ms. May from the Training and Development Unit and Terrence and Ryan from the IT unit. We'll see you again this afternoon at 2 p.m. for the webinar in science. Thanks again, Sir Rafi. You have a good day.
Thank you, Pressy.
Okay, bye.
Thank you, everyone.